Hey everyone, Israel is currently in a war against the terror organization Hamas, and we know how hard it can be to keep up with all the news. So if you haven't had the time to stay on top of the latest developments out of Israel, we're here for you. I'm Ladarga Velazi, and this is ILTV's Weekly Review.
Overnight, the IDF retrieved the bodies of 6 Israeli hostages from a Hamas tunnel in Rafah. According to the army, they were murdered by their captors only a few days before they were found. Prime Minister Netanyahu said the murders prove that Hamas does not want a hostage for ceasefire deal.
בימים אלה, בשעה שישראל מנהלת משא ומתן אינטנסיבי מול המתווכות במאמץ עליון להגיע לעסקה, החמאס ממשיך לסרב בתוקף לכל הצעה. חמור מכך, באותו זמן ממש הוא רצח 6 מחטופינו. מי שרוצח חטופים לא רוצה עסקה.
The hostages whose bodies were recovered are those of Hirsch Goldberg, Poland, 23, Eden Yerushalmi, 24, Ori Danino, 25, Alex Lubnov, 32, Carmel Gat, age 40, and Almog Sarusi, 25. The IDF did not have the exact location of the hostages, but had indications of a general area where the 6 captives could be held. The tunnel in which the slain hostages were found in Rafah is about 1 kilometer away from where the soldiers found and rescued hostage Farhan al-Qadi alive earlier this week.
על פי הערכה הראשונית העומדת ברשותנו, הם נרצחו באכזריות על ידי מחבלי חמאס זמן קצר לפני שהגענו אליהם. הם נחטפו חיים בבוקר 7 באוקטובר על ידי ארגון הטרור חמאס. גופותיהם אותרו במהלך הלחימה ברפיח במנהרה תת-קרקעית. במרחק כקילומטר מהמנהרה ממנה חילצנו לפני מספר ימים את פרחן קאדי.
Troops began to search a tunnel complex until they found the hostages' bodies yesterday afternoon. Overnight, their bodies were extracted from Gaza and brought to Israel for identification. There were no clashes with Hamas terrorists inside the tunnel, and the guards who likely murdered the 6 fled the area. Goldberg, Poland, Yerushalmi, Danino, Lubnov, and Sarusi were abducted from the Nova Music Festival near Kibbutz Re'im by Hamas terrorists on October 7th. Gat was taken from Kibbutz Be'eri. Hirsch was a dual U.S.-Israeli citizen, and President Biden issued a personal statement to his parents. I have worked tirelessly to bring your beloved Hirsch safely to you, and I am heartbroken by the news of his death. It is as tragic as it is reprehensible. Make no mistake, Hamas leaders will pay for these crimes, and we will keep working around the clock for a deal to secure the release of the remaining hostages. Biden insisted the hostage for ceasefire deal is still within reach. Mediated efforts by the U.S., Egypt, and Qatar to broker a deal between Israel and Hamas are still ongoing, but there are sticking points. The Security Cabinet passed a motion supported by Prime Minister Netanyahu insisting that the IDF remain on the Philadelphia corridor in any hostage for ceasefire agreement. Defense Minister Gallant was the lone dissenting voice, arguing that the IDF can manage without Philadelphia and it's holding up an agreement.
A general one-day strike was called today by the Histadrut labor union to express outrage over the Hamas murder of 6 Israeli hostages in Gaza. Mass protests were held today and overnight, demanding more action to bring the remaining hostages home. The government insists that Hamas is still stalling a deal and not Israel. ILTV's Steve Leibowitz has the report.
As funerals are being held for the hostages murdered in Gaza, hundreds of thousands of Israelis took to the streets to demand more action to secure a deal for the remaining hostages' release. Main roads were blocked for hours. The protests were mostly orderly, but there were some clashes with police and arrests.
We see firsthand that they don't have any more time. The hostages are dying in the tunnels by Hamas. They've been murdered. And we have no more time. We need them home now.
The protest was given a jolt when the Histadrut Labor Federation called a one-day strike to protest the government's Gaza strategy for a hostage for ceasefire deal. Union chiefs and business leaders joined forces in the national outpouring of grief, fury, and protest after the bodies of 6 hostages who were known to be alive only days ago were returned to Israel for burial.
מחר אנחנו חייבים לזעוק את זעקת הארץ האהובה שלנו. חייבים לזעוק את זעקת החטופים. העקורים, ההרוגים שלנו, חייבים להחזיר את מדינת ישראל לשגרה.
The decision by Histadrut leader Arnon Bar David included a shutdown at Ben Gurion Airport and the broadest expression of anti-government dissent since the start of the war on October 7th. But not all local authorities agreed with the decision to strike, and the government called the non-labor-related Histadrut action to be misdirected and illegal. Prime Minister Netanyahu insists that Hamas and not Israel is stalling a potential hostage deal.
Prime Minister Netanyahu addressed the nation and held a press conference explaining and defending the cabinet decision to insist that Israel remain on the Philadelphia axis as a condition for Israeli agreement to a hostage for ceasefire deal proposed by mediators. The Prime Minister's comments came after U.S. President Joe Biden said Netanyahu was not doing enough to reach a deal. ILTV's Steve Leibovitz reports.
Prime Minister Netanyahu began his comments by apologizing to the families of the 6 hostages who were executed last week by Hamas and asked for their forgiveness. He also claimed that the IDF was very close to rescuing the 6 alive.
ואני חוזר ואומר גם הערב, אני מבקש את סליחתכם שלא הצלחנו להביא אותם חזרה בחיים. היינו קרובים, אבל לא הצלחנו. ואני חוזר ואומר גם הערב, ישראל לא תעבור לסדר היום על הטבח הזה. החמאס ישלם על כך מחיר כבד מאוד.
Standing in front of a map of Gaza and Israel for illustration, Netanyahu insisted that Israel will never withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor, this to prevent Hamas from taking hostages out of Gaza to Sinai and ultimately to Iran. According to Netanyahu, the Egyptian border corridor is of strategic importance, calling it the pipeline for Hamas oxygen and rearmament.
ציר הרשע צריך את ציר פילדלפי. ומאותה סיבה, אנחנו חייבים לשלוט בציר פילדלפי. חמאס מתעקש מהסיבה הזאת שלא נהיה שם, ומהסיבה הזאת אני מתעקש שכן נהיה שם.
The Prime Minister rejected the notion that Israel could not now change direction following the murder of the 6 Israeli hostages.
What has changed in the last 5 days? What has changed? One thing. These murderers executed 6 of our hostages. They shot them in the back of the head. That's what's changed. And now after this, we're asked to show seriousness? We're asked to make concessions?
Prime Minister Netanyahu's comments came after U.S. President Biden said a ceasefire hostage deal was very close, and Netanyahu was not doing enough to make it happen now.
Are you planning to present a final hostage deal to both sides this week?
We're very close to that.
What makes you think that this deal will be successful in a way that the other deals were not?
Hope springs eternal.
Mr. President, do you think it's time for Prime Minister Netanyahu to do more on this issue? Do you think he's doing enough?
No.
Do you have a message for the hostages' family, sir?
Yes, I've spoken to the American hostage. I spoke to his mom and dad, and we're not giving up. We're going to continue to push as hard as we can. Thank you.
After Netanyahu's speech, there were angry protests in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem outside the home of the Prime Minister. They were demanding that the Prime Minister and his government do more to bring the hostages home alive.
And as the war wages on, the economy has taken a hit, with the war so far costing 250 billion shekels, or roughly around $67 billion. Finance Minister Smotrich has presented new plans to finance these high costs. ILTV's Ariella Lachiani joins us from the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange with more. Ariella, what can you tell us?
Yes, thank you, Ladar. So Finance Minister Smotrich has stated that we are not only in the longest, but also the most expensive war in this country's history, with a total of 200 to 250 billion shekels in direct costs. Now, he's laid out an initial state budget framework for 2025 based on a deficit of 4% of GDP to tackle these high costs. And he's laid out several proposals as to how he expects the country to reach that budget. And he's actually stated that he doesn't believe raising taxes, including corporate taxes and income taxes during a war, is right, and instead he plans on freezing planned tax changes and efficiency measures in government ministries, as well as a complete freeze on the salaries of Knesset members, ministers and senior officials. Now, this in conjunction with the recent downgrading of the credit rating, as well as skyrocketing spending on the military and civilians, is placing the government under immense pressure to ensure they maintain fiscal responsibility and credibility during this ongoing war.
And moving on, the IDF anti-terror operation is continuing in Samaria with a focus on Jenin. Now ending its first week, Operation Summer Camps aims to preempt terror centers known to be planning attacks. More from ILTV's Steve Leibovitz.
There were exchanges of fire and airstrikes in the northern Samaria city of Jenin, long considered one of the major terror hotspots in the territories. The army says 14 terrorists have been killed and about 25 others arrested. Sappers neutralized about 30 explosive devices. The operation is in its 7th day, dubbed Summer Camps by the army. The raids began simultaneously in Jenin, Tulkarem, and Tubas, with the goal of dismantling Iran-backed Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terror networks operating in those cities. So far, according to the IDF, more than 30 gunmen have been killed in the operation, among them the head of the Hamas in Jenin and the head of Islamic Jihad in Tulkarem. One Israeli soldier has been killed in Jenin, and several more troops have been wounded in the raids. The raids in Tulkarem and Farah have since concluded, but troops are pressing on with operations in Jenin, where a drone strike was carried out against a group of Palestinians who were hurling explosives at troops. Senior IDF officials say that the operations in Jenin are primarily aimed at giving the military operational freedom to be able to act there in the future to thwart terror attacks. This was also the stated goal of the last major operation in Jenin more than a year ago. 3 police officers were killed in a terrorist shooting attack this morning on a highway in Judea. They've been named as Arik Ben Eliyahu, age 37, Hadass Brentz, 53, and Rani Shakuri, father of a policewoman killed on October 7th. The attack comes after 2 bomb-laden cars exploded in Gush Etzion amid an ongoing anti-terror operation in Samaria. According to initial reports, terrorists arrived in the area and fired at a police car, hitting 3 officers before fleeing the scene. 2 were declared dead at the scene and 1 died in hospital. The names of the victims were not given, but they were a man and woman in their 30s and a man in his 50s. The vehicle used by the terrorists was abandoned shortly after the attack. Security forces have launched a search. Over the weekend, in the Etzion block south of Jerusalem, 2 cars exploded, each packed with makeshift explosive devices in what is believed to have been a coordinated attack. The 2 terrorists involved in the attacks were killed by troops at the scene. In the first incident, a car exploded at a gas station near the Gush Etzion junction. Troops arriving at the scene shot and killed the terrorist who had arrived in the vehicle and attempted to attack them. 20 minutes later, a terrorist breached into the nearby Karmei Tzur settlement before being shot dead. The terrorist car exploded inside the community. There were no injuries. The IDF then encircled Hebron and nearby towns in the area where the 2 bombers came from. The army located and demolished the bomb-making lab in Hebron. The army said there is no immediate danger of more bombings, and the incident is considered over. 6 Palestinians suspected with involvement in the dual-car bombing attacks were arrested.
אתמול בלילה היה פיגוע של 2 רכבי תופת, יצא מאזור חברון לאזור גוש עציון, ותסתכלו על הפיגוע הזה, מה שאתם עושים כאן, הכניסה לתוך מחנות הפליטים, בדיוק הרעיון שהמחבלים לא יוכלו להטעין את חומר הנפץ על רכב התופת, ולצאת ולעשות פיגוע ביישוב, על כוחות צה"ל או בכל מקום אחר, ומפה הרעיון ההתקפי הזה של ללכת ולהיכנס לטרור למקומות שבהם הוא בונה את יכולות החבלה, זה דבר מאוד מאוד חשוב.
The major ongoing IDF anti-terrorist sweep is continuing in Samaria, and the focus has now moved from Nur Shams and Tulkarem and Farah to Jenin. Troops raided a Jenin neighborhood where they neutralized dozens of explosive devices that were planted along the roads. Fierce gunfights erupted between IDF troops and Palestinian gunmen. An IDF soldier was killed in the clashes. He was identified as Staff Sergeant Elkanah Navon, age 20, from Petah Tikva. Since the start of the anti-terror operation last week, the IDF says troops have killed at least 26 terrorists and detained many wanted men.
אין לנו שום כוונה לתת לטרור באיו"ש להרים את הראש, ולכן היוזמה לעבור עיר-עיר, מחנה פליטים, עם מודיעין מצוין, עם יכולות מבצעיות טובות מאוד, עם מעטפת מודיעינית אווירית חזקה מאוד, ובעיקר עם לוחמים, מפקדים, ערכיים מאוד, נחושים מאוד. אני רואה בדיוק את הדבקות במשימה. אנחנו בדרך הזו נגן על אזרחי ישראל, זה בדיוק ככה.
A general one-day strike was called today by the Histadrut labor union to express outrage over the Hamas murder of 6 Israeli hostages in Gaza. Mass protests were held today and overnight, demanding more action to bring the remaining hostages home. The government insists that Hamas is still stalling a deal and not Israel. ILTV's Steve Leibowitz has the report.
As funerals are being held for the hostages murdered in Gaza, hundreds of thousands of Israelis took to the streets to demand more action to secure a deal for the remaining hostages' release. Main roads were blocked for hours. The protests were mostly orderly, but there were some clashes with police and arrests.
We see firsthand that they don't have any more time. The hostages are dying in the tunnels by Hamas. They've been murdered. And we have no more time. We need them home now.
The protest was given a jolt when the Histadrut Labor Federation called a one-day strike to protest the government's Gaza strategy for a hostage-for-ceasefire deal. Union chiefs and business leaders joined forces in the national outpouring of grief, fury, and protest after the bodies of 6 hostages who were known to be alive only days ago were returned to Israel for burial.
מחר אנחנו חייבים לזעוק את זעקת הארץ האהובה שלנו. חייבים לזעוק את זעקת החטופים, העקורים, ההרוגים שלנו. חייבים להחזיר את מדינת ישראל לשגרה.
The decision by Histadrut leader Arnon Bar David included a shutdown at Ben Gurion Airport and the broadest expression of anti-government dissent since the start of the war on October 7th. But not all local authorities agreed with the decision to strike, and the government called the non-labor-related Histadrut action to be misdirected and illegal. Prime Minister Netanyahu insists that Hamas and not Israel is stalling a potential hostage deal. As the new school year began in Israel today, the country faces the dual challenge of ongoing war and the displacement of thousands of families. The IDF have implemented extraordinary measures to safeguard students and staff, while the education system grapples with providing proper education to evacuee children. ILTV's Ariela Lachiani went back to school.
Yes, as we mark September 1st, we mark the first day back to school, and what is typically a very joyous day full of excitement as we start the new school year, this year is definitely overshadowed by the ongoing war. Many students are suffering as their parents are serving in the reserves, and the IDF are preparing to ensure the safety and security of all students amid the war, including deploying hundreds of bomb shelters near bus stops and schools, and also stationing reserve soldiers near school campuses amid any possible threats. More in the following report. In response to the current security situation, the IDF has deployed hundreds of bomb shelters at bus stops and near schools nationwide. Reservists have been stationed at key intersections and school campuses for rapid response to any threat. The early warning system has been upgraded, and soldiers are filling in for educators who have been called to reserve duty. With Hezbollah's near-daily assaults, thousands of families have been displaced and relocated across Israel. According to the Taub Center, around 68,500 Israelis have been evacuated from northern communities, with 17,000 of them being school-aged children. The Education Ministry has set up temporary educational frameworks in various locations, including new K-12 schools in Eilat, Tiberias, and Tel Aviv. As Israel navigates these unprecedented challenges, the resilience of its people and the preparedness of its institutions are being put to the test. The education system, like the rest of the country, is adapting to ensure that even in times of crisis, the future remains a priority.
In a major announcement, the United States has unsealed terrorism charges against Hamas's top leadership for their roles in a decades-long campaign to try and murder American citizens, and for their roles in the deadly October 7th massacre. The charges call out Hamas's leadership not only in Gaza, but also in Lebanon and Qatar. The details in the following report. The United States Justice Department announced on Tuesday it's bringing terrorism and criminal charges against Hamas's top leaders for their roles in planning, supporting, and perpetrating the October 7th massacre, which killed some 1,200 people, including over 40 Americans.
Today, the Justice Department unsealed charges against Yahya Sinwar and other senior leaders of Hamas for financing and directing a decades-long campaign to murder American citizens and endanger the security of the United States.
The complaint names 6 defendants, among them Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, Khalid Mashal, Hamas's leader residing in Qatar, and Ali Baraka, a senior Hamas official based in Lebanon. The other 3 defendants, former Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh, former military wing chief Mohammed Daif, and former deputy military commander Marwan Issa, have all since been killed.
As outlined in our complaint, those defendants, armed with weapons, political support, and funding from the government of Iran and support from Hezbollah, have led Hamas's efforts to destroy the state of Israel and murder civilians in support of that aim.
The Attorney General also said that the U.S. was investigating the murder of American-Israeli hostage Hersh Goldberg Polin, whose body was recovered over the weekend by the IDF. According to Reuters, citing a Justice Department official, U.S. prosecutors brought the charges against Hamas already in February, but kept the complaint under seal in the hopes of capturing Haniyeh. For more of the latest updates from Israel, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at ILTV.tv or download the ILTV Plus app. That's it for ILTV's weekly review. Stay safe and see you next week.